Hey, I feel compelled to tell you I'm a little nervous, but we'll get through it. I actually took third place the first year, and the reason I point that out is the difference was $50,000. Um, so that was major, um, as you can imagine, but still a great honor. When they asked me to name my talk today, I came up with this because I always try to be as vague as possible when I'm supposed to be as detailed as possible, and so I came up with this thinking that I could sort of bend it into portraiture, which is my main area of focus, and that it would have some resonance with Daigh. And then I was writing it and tweaking it, and I got to thinking about what a clever and charismatic guy I was, and so I changed it just slightly to this instead. And so I hope you'll forgive me, but we're going to talk about me for the next 18 minutes instead of you. And the way we're going to do it is through talking about my adventures in self-portraiture. And so periodically I end up making self-portraits, whether I mean to or not. And it's been a really rewarding experience. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why that is for me. This is one that I made, I think, in 2007 out of Pushpins. And this is one that I made several years later. And this is from a project that I started called Stomach. And so I'll explain to everyone why this is a portrait, and I think a strong portrait, and why I hope to make more of them. This is also a self-portrait, and it's not because I'm the snake or the frog, but rather the medium through which this might arrive on your wall, and so I'll explain that in detail as well. And so we'll back up here first and talk about the portraits. These are, in case you haven't noticed, not me. These are not self-portraits, and the reason they're strong, the reason that they work, in my opinion, is that they are closely cropped and evenly lit, and those are both mechanisms that help us sort of remove every obstacle that's in the way of the subject and the viewer, in my opinion. So the more I can kick all that out and just leave you and the person you're looking at, I think the greater the chances are of us understanding and getting some humanity and some identity out of that person, and hopefully finding some in ourselves and having a dialogue take place. And so that's been in a nutshell what the aim is with these portraits, and I think that that's why they work. But if I had shown up here in 2009 with these three portraits, I think it's fair to assume that I wouldn't have fared as well as I did in Art Prize. And the reason that I was able to do as well as I was that I changed the delivery method, and I printed them in a different way, right? And I did it in Pushpins. And I think there's a lot of ways to say why this is interesting or gimmicky, and I think nobody's better at giving those reasons than me. But what I like about them, and what I think does work, this is a photo that I shot of Chicago's former Mayor Daigh, and I think what's interesting about a portrait is all that humanity that's there, and all the Pushpin pieces were all extensions of a question that I had, or sort of a thesis that I was exploring, which was if we could take everything that worked out of a portrait and look at it again, do we still have the identity of that subject? And if we did, why did we have that? If we could take away all the resolution and all the subtle nuance of the color and let it exist still, was there still human on the other end, and we were getting something about their story and their identity from them? And if we were, why was that? And what were we closer to understanding this sort of intangible nature of our spirit and how those things exist? And I think further, there's a question or a discussion taking place about how simple our ingredients might be, and how what we call unique is really just an arrangement of those simple ingredients. And I think there was sort of a brotherhood that came out of that notion that we're all made out of simple ingredients, but the way they're stacked up makes us different. And so I think that's an interesting question as well, is what do we learn about ourselves by considering how simple we are and our ingredients are. And so here's the self-portrait again. And when I think I've come to learn that when I'm in a project and it's very, very close to failing, and what I mean by that with regard to this image is when it's just almost going to be an arrangement of color, something vague and sort of opaque that doesn't represent anything, but in the end just barely does. Maybe you see that that's me there, and there's something about the state that I was in there, or who I was at that moment, then I'm most happy, as opposed to an overwhelming victory or something that's just powerful all over the place. I like when it almost doesn't work, or one day you read it and say it doesn't, and then another day it does. That's when I'm happiest. So this is some work. This is my Midwest gallery in Chicago, and this is my strong and beautiful wife, Meg. This is my son, Harper. This is Lance. This is Deborah. This next one is this is at the Armory show in New York City, and if you're an artist, it's a big deal when you get to be there. It's a platform that I was very honored to arrive at, but I sort of came there through the back door, if you will, because this was a corporate commission, and this came, once Art Prize happened and everything, I had sort of heralded my beginning into being a professional artist and getting paid to do it, and so these things sort of come with, or can come with that, a corporate commission, and it was the first step outside of representational portraiture. I wasn't doing a human face anymore, and it turns out this is one of my favorite pieces. I'm most proud of this than almost everything else that I've ever done. But at the time, I felt like it was a grand sellout, and so it's titled "Sex for Money." This piece is. And I made it for Acura, for the car company, and they weren't pleased with the title of it, but I had contractually they had to let me title it, so it was all right. But so that piece was, if you're in front of it, it's 8 feet tall by 12 feet wide. It's just monolithic, and it's very heavy. It took a long time to produce, and I enjoy making work like that. That's very singular and exists that way. But then I wanted to go to another end of the spectrum and make something that was more portable and immediate. And so, sort of humbly following in footsteps of a lot of the street artists that I was paying attention to at the time, I came up with sort of photorealistic stencil graffiti pieces. And so I'd make these stencils, and it enabled me to do one-offs and more like a printing press, but still retain the beat-up portrait notion. So I made this one of the mayor, and this is another piece of my son, but again, many times over. And this piece, I think it's fun to note, was by design, was painted over at the end of this exhibition, so it didn't exist anymore, which was fun for me. And it turned out to be a theme that would come in later, creating things that were ephemeral, that were by design not going to last. And this is almost the biggest piece I've done, not quite as big as the Acura piece, but this is probably as good as it's going to get. I think the technique is at best display here, that being of the faces. And I was paid handsomely to make this. It was another corporate commission. And there I was, making a living doing what I loved, which I had sort of come to believe was the dream. That was the idea. Let's do this. But during that time, as you can see here, I became very sullen and very disenchanted, very despondent, and it was like this all the time. I always looked like that, and I was wondering why. I didn't know why I felt that way, but I was also then questioning, second guessing, what was I doing all this for? Toward what end? And if this hasn't made me happy to be having this be my career, then what was? And that gave way to strong feelings about a lot of the people that I was working with, not all the people, but a lot of the people that I was working with and for and around. And feeling that way gave way to feelings about myself and what my role was and how I was behaving. And it was daily. You'd be like, "Why are you doing this?" And so it was a rough time. It was a bad time. And so this became my prescription. I was like, "Well, I'll get out of it this way. No big deal. This is how we'll get through it." And I came up with sort of a task for myself, which was to put down portraiture. Right? So not forever, but stop making portraits and just do something else. Do something you're not going to make any money at, and just go to play. And so I picked up or re-picked up a software package that I'd used in my previous career called Cinema 4D, and it's like 3D sculpting. So Pixar movies are made with something similar to this. And it had recently added the ability to do dynamics, which meant that the things you created could now bounce off one another, which hadn't existed prior. And so gravity makes sense, and friction makes sense, and all these can be tweaked, and everything sort of behaves in a physically accurate manner, or close to physically accurate. It's like fake nature. So I was like, great, this fits in perfect with me playing God. And at the same time, I became aware of this guy, and his name's Roman Signer, and he fast became my favorite living artist, and is today. And this is a clip of him from a documentary about him. But so he's sort of the situational artist, and he, to me, means everything about entropy and absurdity and like things are going to happen, but when they happen, you're still like, wow, And it was so simple, though. And I was like, this guy is the best artist. This is what it is all about, right? Like, it's like the history of the world right there. And so I became really, really into him. And I could go all day with that thing. So what I did is I made a replica of my living room, and I started putting things in it, and then just letting them fall down, and that was it. And I fell straight away in love with it. It was onto something for sure. I was so happy just watching all these things come crashing down in what wasn't really my living room, but was sort of like my living room. And it enabled me, like, I didn't have to get all of these basketballs. I didn't need to clean them up or worry about the noise or if I was going to get hurt in the process. But I could just have all this entropy take place. And there was something, again, about trying to play God and having all these things just explode that felt great. And so I just was doing that. But in the process, I realized that I had started out not to make portraits, and I wasn't going to do that. But then I started looking at these pieces, and I thought, it looks like there's something that's interesting that's going to happen here. But instead, something interesting really didn't happen, and everything sort of fell off to the side, and it didn't work out the way you thought it was going to, and then it was over. And all of these, when I was saying to myself, felt very resonant and very personal. And then I decided that, oh, I'm making self-portraits here. That's what I'm doing. This is me. This is a picture of me falling down, and that meant something to me. That was sort of this watershed moment where I was like, okay, this is a new kind of portraiture. I'm gonna follow this. And so that was where Stomach was born, and that's this project. And the way it works in a nutshell is that you take this survey on my website and you fill out like a couple dozen questions, and they'll ask you things like, how many living parents do you have? Do you believe in faith or science? How many orgasms do you expect to have in the next month? Do you drink every day? And my contention was that in the photos that I've been taking, there were finite answers to these questions that were writ in the faces of these subjects. And you couldn't say exactly where the drinking or the orgasms were on display, but they probably factored into what that person looked like and how they were there. And I thought that was really compelling, that they were hidden and on display at the same time. And so it became a means then of, well, if I can connect the dots between this and the portraits and the identity of somebody, then maybe I'll be onto something. And so through these surveys, it's sort of like a brief corner of how it works with the math. But if I ask you something about loneliness, and I say, how lonely are you? I don't think I'm likely to get a useful response from you. But if I ask you how many living parents you have, if you've ever watched a pet die, if you feel you can depend on a certain number of people, then I might get something that tells me a little bit about your loneliness. And I might, in turn, then be able to pour that into a cup in the computer and mix it with other cups, and that might contribute to how low the ceiling is in the room, or how many windows there are, or if the sun is high in the sky. And that might emotionally have a push of something like loneliness. And so I thought that I could take this and all these other qualities. So if I took this survey, maybe that loneliness question would play out like this. Or if you took it, then maybe it would look like this. And this one could be my mother, like her answers might play out differently, and which is saying nothing about my mother, but it could be anybody. And so you get the idea. And so then it's like pumping more and more ingredients in, things that are going to be called upon or maybe not called upon that are going to be in the room. But it's key to note that, like, I'm not reading the survey questions and saying, let's darken the room a little bit. What I'm doing is, again, playing God and focusing on a system. So if I wake up hungover in Grand Rapids, I'm likely to maybe be grumpy about somebody's, their read, but I didn't want that to be there. I wanted to sort of take myself out of the equation, just make the system and let the system decide. So these are shots from sort of the desk of the project, working on. And then I wanted to think, if the answers were like a sheet of music and the room was like a banjo, then you could also say, well, let's see now what it looks like on a clarinet or on a piano or something like that. And so the project has the ability then to take all those answers and push them through some totally different manifestation of those answers. So now your loneliness question could play out in the lighting or in the fluidity of this material here, or the wind that's influencing it and blowing on it and all these sort of things. So we have near infinite ways of looking at ourselves now if we just build the system and let them play out, and everybody's answer could be subtly different and hopefully reflective of them. And then we can take this idea and build on it. And so in a year, the project could be, what would we look like if we were a wrecked and salvaged car? Or if we were a dining room, how might that look? A supermarket, same thing. Or maybe your answers make you look like a supermarket, but somebody else's, they end up like Versailles or somewhere in between. It's something like that. And so that's the project. That's Stomach in a nutshell. And I wanted a more graceful segue into the last project. You have to believe me, but the best thing I could do was come back here, and it was, and that's not, that's not a statement from me to you, but it was, but my career had been, I think what I keyed into with my Discontent was that there was so much about control, like any other endeavor, that was weighing on me, and the people that were buying the work and the people that were selling the work and talking about the work, they all exerted different amounts of control over me, and maybe I wasn't exerting as much control as I needed over myself. But it all came back to this control, and I thought to myself, what would a project look like that was somebody paying to put a lack of control on their wall? What would that be like? And so that's where the Weather was born. And what the Weather is this box in the middle. You take it home and you plug it in, and you turn it on, and there are no user operable controls except for this little power switch that you see down in the lower corner. And the content that's on it is 100% driven by me. So there's no way to back it up, stop it, rewind, or anything like that, except if you just turn the power off. And so again, here I get to play God for this one rectangle on your wall. I get to decide wholly what goes on there, and when it goes up, and what happens next. And that was really exciting for me, because I thought, like its namesake, if you didn't like the way it was going, you could just wait and maybe it would get better. And if you did like the way it was going, then you should get in there and enjoy it if you had the time, if your schedule permitted, because it also wasn't going to be there forever. And so it becomes this constant tether to me. And so my relationship with a collector, good or bad, just never has to end. And so I'm constantly there on their wall. And I liked that. Again, the power, the control had come back to me, and it was in my pocket now. And so if I were to die, and this was on, then this is just going to loop until the electronics give out inside. And I like that too, that we were constantly in a dialogue, but a dialogue in which I get to do all the talking. And and that was good. And what it did, it was designed to do, but has been a weight that I wanted to invite on myself, is that it's a constant mouth to feed. I have to produce stuff for this all the time. So I've sort of removed from myself the option of, I won't do any work today, or I won't have a project on the horizon. And it's great because it freed me up to think that they didn't have to be great. I could just make work, and it was going to be good sometimes, and sometimes it was going to be better than others. But I could just put stuff up there, and then it would go away. And that was really a romantic idea for me. And I think the reason it was most romantic is the ephemera of it, that this was all going to keep going. And so the work, as much time as I put into it, and as beautiful or unbeautiful as it turned out, this wasn't the work. The box that brought it to you was the work. And by extension then, I think that all these banal scenes and all these things that I contribute and put in front of you and put on your wall, they do in fact become yet another self-portrait. And I hadn't intended for it to end up that way either. And so again, while I can relate to both, maybe, I'm not either of these guys, but I'm this box that comes onto your wall, and that makes me feel good. And that's what the self-portrait idea for me is about, is that periodically I've stopped, and whether I wanted to or not, I have looked at myself, and I've come away with a picture of what that looks like. And when I hold on to those and I look at them over time, I feel that I win something, and it helps to calm myself. And so that's my advice to you, is that in whatever way is your way, you should stop and you should take an objective look at yourself, and you should come away with some piece of what you found and hang on to that. And I think if we can all do that, then we might know ourselves, and by extension each other, a little better. So those are the ideas. Thanks very much.